This is episode 99 of the Memory Palace podcast, as well as the third episode I am producing for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York as its artist in residence. Now, this story can be listened to anywhere, but in a perfect world, you would be listening to it in Gallery 735 in the American Wing at the Met. This is the Memory Palace. I'm Nate DiMeo. The nation was brand new, and it needed new everything, essentially. A navy, an economic system, mottos and symbols and office supplies. And it needed artists to celebrate and articulate Americanness to its citizens and to the world beyond. Whatever Americanness turned out to be. Now, artists are not a navy or even letterhead when you get right down to it. But at the beginning of the Republic, at a moment of boundless possibility, in a certain youthful idealism, they were a nagging, unchecked box in the Founding Fathers' to-do list. John Vanderlin was born the year before the Declaration in 1775 in Kingston, New York. His father was a painter, though his old man could never quite make a living at it. He installed windows and sold paint and brushes to get by. And his son was determined to be more. More than his dad, sure. That's just the normal order of things. But John wanted to be more than just a painter. He wanted to be a great American artist. A man of the age. And why couldn't he be? What wasn't possible for a young white man in this young country in that moment? He was a teenager when he convinced Gilbert Stuart to take him on as an apprentice. You know Stuart's work from the dollar bill in your wallet. The classic George Washington portrait with the pursed-lipped consternation of a man with the world in his shoulders and terrible dentures in his mouth. Vanderlin would copy Stuart's portraits for practice, and one day the subject of one of those portraits stopped by the studio. It was Aaron Burr. You know him too. And Burr thought the kid had talent, and thought maybe he could be just what the country needed. And so he paid to send John Vanderlin to Europe to study with the greatest painters of the old world, so he could come back to the new world and harness the spirit of these recently united states. Its plain-spoken republicanism, its pluralism, its embrace of the individual citizen and self-determination and aesthetic simplicity, and its rejection of kings and queens and European opulence. John Vanderlin went to France in 1796. He studied with venerated masters. He was hailed in Parisian salons. He won medals, but he also got stranded. He ran into money trouble. Burr killed Hamilton, and that was a whole thing, and then other patrons were hard to come by. And then France itself was nuts. In the nearly 20 years Vanderlin spent there, he saw the French Revolution, the guillotining of monarchs, the rise of Napoleon, the fall of Napoleon, the restoration of one monarchy and then another. And he took it all in. And when the dust cleared, he was ready to show America what he'd learned. It was 1815. He was still young, but he was a man of the world, at the height of his artistic powers. And he set sail for home, determined to become America's greatest painter. He arrived in New York to find that position had already been taken. John Trumbull had studied overseas too, first in England and then a bit in France. And Trumbull had beaten Vanderlin home, and was already enthralling audiences with sweeping paintings of the recent past. The surrenders of Cornwallis and Burgoyne, the battles of Princeton and Trenton and Bunker Hill. And the paintings were pretty good. They had some scale, they had a sort of, if not quite majesty, an oomph. But Vanderlin knew he had Trumbull beat. In a barn in Kingston, John Vanderlin was hard at work at a project of undeniable scale that oozed oomph. In France, he had seen panoramic paintings, circular landscapes so massive they literally surrounded viewers and immersed them within the scene, in the battlefield, in the Alpine Valley, wherever. They gave people the illusion of travel, a feeling that they'd been transported out of their lives, and Vanderlin knew exactly where he wanted to send them. While he was in his studio in his barn month after month, with rain rapping on the roof or cold winter wind whistling, Vanderlin was thinking back to a day not long before. Late summer, just outside Paris, in the garden of Versailles, when he'd stood in the sun, mist from a burbling fountain, the perfume of flowers, September sounds, dragonflies and birdsong, crunching gravel beneath the feet of running children, laughter aloft in the warm air. A perfect day that he had spent making meticulous sketches, using an optical device that allowed him to trace the scene onto linen and capture every detail and angle, all while thinking of home, and imagining how he would share this perfect moment with America and begin his inevitable rise. It took him more than a year to finish his panorama, and when it was done, he needed a place to hang it, so he built one. On a June afternoon in 1819, visitors walked between the neoclassical columns of the Vanderlin Rotunda, a 2-story brick building, cylindrical like the Pantheon, and capped with a 30-foot-tall zinc-plated dome that would change color with the changing angle of the light, and flash bright as clouds broke above the park downtown where it stood by City Hall. For a quarter, you could ascend spiral stairs at the center of the building and emerge onto a circular platform beneath the dome and marvel at Vanderlin's painting. Here was Versailles, at the verge of autumn. Men in high hats and spats and lacquered canes, fine ladies strolling arm in arm, a boy chasing a butterfly, as the shadows grew long in the lovely late afternoon. And there in the room, light streamed through a hole cut in the glinting dome, and shifted with the clouds, and shifted with the seasons, and brought his painting to life, and brought Americans, for a moment, to Versailles. But Versailles wasn't a place Americans wanted to be. Not in that first year it was open, when the panorama brought in a mere $1,200. The painting alone had cost him $2,000, not to mention the building. Now critics, some of them anyway, were impressed by what Vanderlin had achieved. But they had to ask, why of all things was this what he wanted to achieve? The panorama was cool, don't get them wrong, but Versailles, in America, when there were beautiful mountains just upstate. Why French royalty? Why aristocratic excess? Why not Minutemen at Lexington or citizen farmers tilling the Shenandoah Valley? Why not transport people to Liberty Hall or Plymouth Rock or Valley Forge? John Trumbull was out there with his history paintings showing every other American artist how it was done, and Vanderlin was out of step with the American character. He had missed a thing or two when he was off in Paris for so long. But rather than taking the hint, or at least another crack at a different panorama, he dug in. He took Versailles on tour. First to Philadelphia, where no one came either, and where the gallery's roof leaked and soaked the painting through. He spent forever fixing it, and forever again trying to make it a success. And it was never a success. He tried for decades. He even went on a misguided and doomed quest to get Congress to buy his Versailles. And he just kept scheming and holding out hope despite all evidence to the contrary that his country would recognize his genius. And in that, at least, he wasn't entirely out of step with the American character. But he had certainly fallen well behind his peers. And he was crestfallen and more than a little bitter when John Trumbull was commissioned to paint patriotic murals in the Capitol Rotunda. And when Congress asked him to take some of the load off an overworked Trumbull and paint a small panel of Columbus landing in San Salvador, it was little consolation. But it was work, at least. It was 1839. He was 64. During all the years he'd spent dragging Versailles around, trying to convince America that he was America's greatest painter, he barely painted. He was rusty, and he knew it. So he went back to France, thinking that being back in France would inspire him, would help him get back to where he'd been before, back when he was young and everything had so much promise. And he found Versailles hadn't changed. Same mist from the same fountains in the same breeze, same long shadows as the day grew late. But he had changed, as one does. And he was heartbroken, he'd write, to be reminded of who he'd been those years before. A young American, standing in this garden, imagining painting this garden, and all that painting this garden was supposed to bring. His Columbus painting was kind of a flop. And Vanderlin's story ends not long after, where so many true tales of dashed dreams do, in a small rented room, where he died alone. And there is a postscript here. If not to Vanderlin's story, then to that of his Versailles. So people die, and their descendants are left to sort through their stuff. Expired bus passes, insurance policies, weird figurines none of the kids want but don't have the heart to throw away. Vanderlin left behind a 165-foot-long painting, and his sister didn't have the heart to throw it away. But she didn't have enough room for it either, so she cut it with a knife into 7 strips, rolled them up and squirreled them away in the basement. And then somehow, 100 years later or so, it was donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It didn't have anywhere to put it either and squirreled it away in its basement for about another 30 years. In the early 80s, they were renovating the building and needed one of their galleries to double as a multi-purpose room, someplace they could hold the occasional cocktail reception or symposium on the future of the American Museum or whatnot. And they realized they had the perfect backdrop already. And I'd like to think that Vanderlin would be pleased to have his painting at the Met. But he was never pleased. And in order to fit Versailles in the room, they had to lop off the top of the painting. So where once was sky, there is now acoustic tile. And what was once a perfect circle that would surround you and transport you is now 2 curved canvases split by 2 doors at either end of the room, to provide exits in case of fire, and passage for people on their way to see something they'd rather see, like a Trumbull maybe. And so it takes a bit of imagination on our part to see Vanderlin's Versailles, as it always has. This episode is written and produced and stuff by me, Nate DiMeo of the Memory Palace podcast, and executive produced by Limor Tomer, general manager of concerts and lectures at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Research assistance from Andrew Milne. My residency is made possible by the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Chester Dale Fund. The Memory Palace is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, which receives support from the Knight Foundation, MailChimp, AdZerk, and from its generous listeners. Learn more about the Memory Palace at thememorypalace.org and subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Radiotopia.